The Sri Lanka attack was nightmarish and devastating, and it left many people without family members. And now we're seeing this story, which, and not just this one story, but a collection of stories about what really happened and why. This is from Al Jazeera. Sri Lanka attack retaliation for NZ massacre. Minister. Initial probe shows Easter Sunday blasts were in response to the deadly Christchurch mosque killings, officials say. Now, almost every story is challenging the narrative from the defense minister. I don't know why they would do that. I don't think you should just outright trust the government, but what gives them where is their reasoning that in any way this wouldn't be the case? Again, by all means, they can say, as Al Jazeera does, they say that without providing evidence or explaining where the information came from, sure, it came from the government. It came from their initial investigation. So, look what he said. The preliminary investigations have revealed what happened in Sri Lanka was in retaliation for the attacks against Muslims in Christchurch, but we are continuing investigations. So I'm not entirely sure why they would frame it this way. It's very strange. We then saw this in the Atlantic. Why Sri Lanka was probably not retaliation. Why? Genuine question. There's a few things I want to get into before we go over this because I've got a bunch of stories here. Breaking news as of this morning, there is a current shootout going on. There were explosions reported, gunfire erupted. They raided a suspected bomb factory, so this is ongoing. We then have this story, which is important context, that ISIS has claimed responsibility. We have this story. Sri Lanka fears new attacks as weekend prayers begin. More attacks on Christians. But not just Christians. So Catholics have canceled Sunday Mass. I'm just trying to go through all this context very quickly. So there was a woman. They raided the home. She was pregnant, and she blew herself up, killing her kids and some police. But we've also seen, and this is the last one before we go back to the main story, and this is the point. Sri Lanka's Muslims face an angry backlash after Easter Sunday attack. So, yes, the story talks about how a mob of, I believe, Christians, let's just read it. Aurangzeb Zabi was cooking rice at a friend's house on Wednesday when he heard angry shouting outside. Looked out the window and saw a mob of Sri Lankan men carrying iron bars. A day after the Islamic State claimed responsibility for suicide bombings that killed more than 350 people, Muslims in some areas of Sri Lanka were facing a rising backlash. The mob surrounded the house. Mr. Zabi, a Pakistani refugee who has lived in Sri Lanka for 2 years, said he grabbed his two children, dashed into the yard, and scampered over two walls before reaching an army checkpoint. There, the mob caught up with him and delivered a harsh beating, begging the soldiers to let them kill him. Hours later, Mr. Zabi still looked terrified. When you face 100 people, he said, and then his voice slipped and he couldn't finish a sentence. His eyes hardened. They even beat my kids. They say gangs of Christian men, look at this, in the town of Negombo, where an attack on a church during Easter services killed more than 100 people, gangs of Christian men moved from house to house, smashing windows, breaking down doors, dragging people into streets, punching them in the face, and threatening to kill them. Dozens of residents said. No deaths were reported, but many Muslims fear it was only a matter of time. If one of the bombers' goals in slaughtering hundreds of innocent men, women, and children at hotels and churches on Easter Sunday was to stir new religious hatred in Sri Lanka, that may now be happening in some areas. And this brings me to these initial stories. Let me just go back real quick and grab the date here, right? This story is from April 24th. We heard this from Al Jazeera on the 23rd. It's entirely possible that because of this reporting, there were Christians saying, you know what, then we're going to strike back. And it's terrifying what's happening. I mean, first of all, what happened in Christchurch is nightmarish as it is. And now you have reports that these people want revenge in a totally different country against totally innocent people. We then hear stories of other innocent people who are now Muslim being beaten by Christians. And this is a dangerous cycle of anger that won't stop. Because in response to the Christian gangs beating people, you will likely see more people who are angry. Because what happens is, the people who carried out this attack did it in response to one crazy, monstrous individual. One guy did that. He does not represent all Christians. So now it's reported that these people said, okay, we'll strike Christians. But Christians didn't do this. One crazy person did. This was Islamic terror. But again, I don't care about what your group is. We have to recognize there are crazy people. I will not blame an entire religion because of the acts of their extremists. I will condemn the extremism. Because here in the U.S., you have many people who peacefully practice their religion and want to live peacefully. Now, many of these people who are religious, regardless of their religion, believe things I don't like or don't believe as well. So long as they abide by the laws, they peacefully assemble, they don't do anything crazy, extreme, regardless of your religion or political beliefs, fine, by all means. You want to be a communist? Great, just don't be a violent authoritarian, right? So I don't know how that works for the most part, but sure. Now, I wonder why this is. Even if the retribution argument were consistent with prior ISIS doctrine, which it's not, the timing is off. Why write this story? In fact, there are many stories saying it's probably not true. Now we can get conspiratorial and political and say they're trying to push down the rhetoric to calm things down. Because you look at this story from the 23rd of April, and then sure enough, a day later, we see this story, that gangs of Christian men are committing acts of violence. It may be that when Christians heard it was retaliation, they said, well, then we're going to retaliate against them. Maybe. But in reality, I think it may just actually be political. Because take a look at, if you've been paying attention, all of these accounts that said Easter worshippers. It was the weirdest thing to me, and I am not a Christian. I did briefly go to Catholic school when I was a kid and then left to go to public school, and I am agnostic, atheist type. I can't really define my religion because it's not easily defined. It's not agnostic and atheist doesn't necessarily represent what I actually believe in terms of religion. Because I do believe in God in a certain kind of sense that can't be explained simply by that word. But I have to wonder why they're pushing this narrative. And so again, I think there may be an inherent bias, right? We saw the Easter worshippers. We saw the refusal to use the word Christian for some reason. Some politicians did. But we also saw something interesting where some conservatives brought up that no matter what happens, they talk about the far right, right? So it's like Christchurch happens. They say, blame all white people, blame the far right. Sri Lanka happens, and they write articles saying, look how the far right responded. Well, I don't care. I literally don't care about the fringe minorities, right? Tell me about what's going on here. I want to know the news about Sri Lanka. And so let's see this. Let's read a little bit. I have seen this before. 8 guys form circle, hands in the center. In this configuration, known to players or team sports as a huddle. What? ISIS calls this huddle a ceremony of bay'ah, a term dating to the earliest days of Islam, and likely before, that historically has involved the physical laying on of hands to swear allegiance to a commander. That's fine. The likely culprits in the killing of more than 300 people in Sri Lanka on Sunday are now, according to the video released a few hours ago, blown up with their victims. The attacks fit none of the patterns of political violence in Sri Lanka. Why hit Christians? Why hotels? But they looked like vintage ISIS handiwork, and so they now are confirmed to be. ISIS loved hitting churches. It aims at international sites to better inflict pain on citizens of the coalition that has succeeded in obliterating its caliphate in Syria. This is a rather annoying... I get really annoyed with journalists who don't get to the point, right? And so, listen. What do you mean, why hit Christians? You're literally writing a story about this, right? Why would you waste my time with... I don't want to read this. The Easter terrorists did not refer to Christchurch at all. An omission that might strike some as strange. What better proof of the Islamic State's core claim that Muslims cannot live full and virtuous lives in non-Muslim lands, and that the caliphate is their only protection and salvation? Here we see that hypersectarianism has its costs. Just because these people weren't sophisticated doesn't mean they weren't associated with ISIS. Some people have pointed out that it was strange that ISIS took so long to claim responsibility, that perhaps they were waiting to see if anyone would, and then went, okay, then did it. But ultimately, these arguments, in my opinion, don't make sense. And I don't necessarily mean this one individual's, but why would anyone question the narrative from the preliminary investigation? Think about any other major story where the government issued a preliminary investigation and everyone accepted it as truth. Okay, why is this different? Perhaps it's because we are seeing a dramatic escalation between religious tensions. And it's not just religious, It is, across the board, identity extremism is apparently on the rise in some capacity. And then we can see the institutionalized nature of how the left is in media and they push lies, which will be my later video, so we'll stick around for that. But even when we have active conflicts, we have, not this one. Let me find the story. Here we go. It fits the MO that we've come to recognize, from so many different attacks. It's also really strange how the news here was just played absolutely differently. When Christchurch happened, it was relentless. Celebrities, everybody, and it may be due to the nature of the broadcast. But then we see this story, And it's almost like they just don't care about what happens in these poorer countries. They care because it's New Zealand. It falls into their own definition of what I'd say is racist. That, we care because it's New Zealand, but we don't care about Sri Lanka because it's brown or whatever. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to make is, for all we know right now, it sounds like there's retaliation on both sides, and it's kind of worrying and troublesome. Because, of course, whenever we see these Islamic extremist attacks, you will see people on the right point the finger and say, this proves, something about Islam. Maybe it does. Maybe Christchurch proves something about Christianity or whiteness or whatever you want to say. I just think it proves that human beings can be extreme. And yes, ideology can fuel that extremism. Isolation can fuel that extremism. So let's end extremism and point to that as the problem. Wouldn't it be great if we solved all our problems with flame wars on Twitter, just angrily tweeting at people? I'd prefer that much more to active conflict. Or maybe a soccer game or something. Instead, we're seeing people show up beating people with pipes. I'll end by saying this, right? This is terrifying. Innocent people being beaten. But this actually sounds like it may not be escalation. If the response to Christchurch was explosions, and the response to explosions was people getting beat up, it's not a good thing. But we can say it is better that the response has been toned down. Ultimately, we want none of it. But, if you had to choose between a dramatic escalation or a slow de-escalation is going to be better. But I the reason I did this is just, what I wanted to bring up in this video is how this is the official response we're getting. And for some reason, the mainstream media is saying, no, don't believe it. Well, why not? This is their investigation. I don't know. Hopefully, it does not continue. But I think we're headed on a dangerous track, not religiously, but politically. It's just the fracturing of various tribes and groups, and this just led to escalation. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to talk about this too much. I just wanted to go through the news. I was thinking about doing a longer video on this for my main channel, but I decided ultimately not to, just to do a quick wrap-up of many of the breaking news stories, and I'll leave it at that. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you at 4 p.m. at youtube.com/Nimcast. Yes, it's a different channel. I'll see you there.